Black, proud, independent, determined, educated, resilient, compassionate, batty, funny, quirky, unique, creative, thoughtful, sincere, loyal, gutsy, vibrant, resourceful, imaginative, engaging, fabulous, awesome. Those are all words that describe me, the Brick City Brown Chick. Welcome to my podcast, What I Know Now. Thanks for listening. Welcome back, everyone, to What I Know Now. This is episode 7, Grief, the Prequel. Grief is something I have dealt with a lot in my life. And grief is something that profoundly changes you. There's an old saying that goes, grief is the only human emotion we all have to bear alone. And that is true. You can be happy in a group with other people, you can be angry in a group with other people. But if you're grieving in sorrow, in mourning, that is an individual journey. That's not a journey you can take with another person, even if you are both going through the same grief. For example, if you have a pair of sisters whose mother died, and one sister was closer to the mother than the other sister, they're going to feel differently. They're going to grieve differently. And grieving and death and dying in general is not something we talk about a lot in America. We all know it's going to happen to all of us someday, some way, but nobody wants to talk about the reality of what that means. And so consequently, in a lot of cases when people die, either we know it's coming or we don't, we're surprised, we're devastated, we don't know what to do with ourselves or how to cope with it because we've never talked about it. And it's not just family conversation that we don't talk about it. We don't talk about it with our friends. It's just a taboo topic. And so this is something I really wanted to talk about on this podcast because I've been through quite a bit of it and I wanted to share what I understood. So this is going to be a two-part episode. As I said, this is episode 7, the prequel. Episode 8 next week will be Grief, the sequel. I thought that worked. So here in the prequel is deaths that happened in my life prior to my father's death. If there has ever been a defining or touchstone moment in my life, it was my father's death. It was and is the most devastating thing that has ever happened to me. And it happened when I was 17. I'm now 53. So it was a long time ago, but it's still very fresh and very profound. And that is one of the first things I wanted to say about grief and grieving is that it never goes away. People like to talk about closure. People like to talk about, well, someone died, I buried them, it's done, it's over, I can move on. That's all true. you can move on. You move on because you have to. You move on because life presents you with no other choice. But that doesn't mean it goes away. It doesn't mean the grieving stops. It never stops. The week I'm taping this episode is, in fact, 36 years to the week that my father died. And as you can tell by the look on my face, it's still right here, and that never goes away. So I wanted to first make sure that that's something people understand. The very first death I remember consciously was my great aunt, whose name was B, who she and my great uncle were my caretakers before I was school age. So I was 2, 3, 4, 5 when they kept me for my parents when my parents went to work. So she died of a heart attack. I was barely 4 years old, I would think. And my parents were determined to make sure I understood not just that good things happen in life, but bad things happen too, and that you have to cope with them. So my parents took me to my great aunt's wake. Now, a lot of people would say a 4-year-old has no business at a wake because kids don't understand death and they're going to run around and be crazy and be inappropriate. But as I said in an earlier episode, most of my cousins are significantly older than me by, 10, 15, and in some cases 20 years. So it's not like there were other children to play with, A, and B, because I was an only child, in all likelihood, I was very much a sort of self-contained, knew better than to act out in public, especially with my mother. She had a look that was just like, don't do that. So I did not understand the circumstances, obviously, but I knew by people crying and people comforting each other that like this was a sad moment. And my father at one point picked me up and took me over to my great aunt's coffin, which was open at the wake. And he let me touch her. And I have no memory, honestly, of how he put it or what he said. I'm sure it was something to the effect of like, excuse me, your aunt's sleeping. And I'm sure I asked, well, why doesn't she wake up or why can't she wake up? And I don't know what his response to that was, but whatever it was, it satisfied 4-year-old me. Like I understood that whatever had happened to her, she was not coming back. So I don't think I really understood the concept of death, but I did understand that she couldn't wake up and wasn't coming back. I look back on that moment in my life with a certain amount of awe for my parents because I honestly don't think that's a decision that many parents would have made just from the perspective of this child is 4, I don't want to scar her for the rest of her life. How am I going to explain death? But they understood that the earlier you expose children to circumstances and situations that they're going to have to deal with for the rest of their life, the better off they will be. And so that did help me early in my life to understand that bad things do happen. And once the bad thing happens, you have to continue on with your life. So I spent quite some time with my great uncle, her husband, after she died. until he died. I think I was 10 or 11. And they never had any children, so they really did like the fact that my parents brought me over and that they spent time with me, and I enjoyed spending time with him. And so by the time he died, I had been through several more deaths in the family. One of my father's sisters had uterine cancer, and I was probably 8. She had kids that were 6, 10, and maybe 14. I think my oldest cousin at that point was 14 on my dad's side. And there were several of us on that side of the family, basically in a 5-year age range. And so the adults sat us down at one point and told us that my aunt was very sick and that she was going to die. And all of us were old enough at that point to understand what that meant. The part that went off the rails for us was they decided, instead of trying to explain what a uterus was to a bunch of little kids, they would tell us that she had female cancer. Now, I chuckle because as an adult, I understand how ridiculous that sounds. But I understand also that we were boys, we were girls. None of us were in the becoming a woman, having a period stage. So it would have been a whole lot to try to explain to us at that particular moment. And my aunt's husband was not coping well. Understandably, he was about to lose his wife. He had 3 young children. It was a lot. So they opted not to even get into that particular conversation and just told us that she had female cancer. Now, of course, one of the side effects of that, which I'm sure they didn't even think about, was that my female cousins and I were shocked and appalled. And after my aunt died, we started talking to each other and saying, does that mean we're going to get female cancer? And how old are you when you get female cancer? Like all those sorts of questions. I think I was about 12 or 13 when I finally said to my mother, like, what is female cancer? And she didn't remember. She remembered my aunt died, but she didn't remember the story. She's like, what in the world are you talking about? So that had to be cleared up for all the girls on that side of the family. But I do remember that very specifically. And the third death that I remember very clearly is my maternal grandmother. My maternal grandmother was a tough lady. She raised 10 children. And she and my grandfather were sharecroppers. And so they farmed tobacco. They didn't own their own land. They had all these children to raise. It was a whole lot. But my grandmother, especially in her older age, as her grandkids came along, was so wise and so beloved by all her grandchildren. She was confined to a wheelchair probably a good 10 years before I was born. And that was because she'd had so many children, the births of those children had stripped the calcium from her bones, which is something we all know now, but nobody knew 60, 70 years ago when she had all those kids. And so she was in a wheelchair, but she lived in a little house in North Carolina with her mother, with my great grandmother, and the two of them got along really well, and my grandmother was super independent. She went to church every Sunday. People would come pick her up for church. People would come pick her up for her doctor's appointments, but she would, can vegetables, and she cooked for herself and cooked for her mother and all those sorts of things. And so when she died, it was very devastating for my mother and her siblings, obviously, for my grandmother's grandchildren, for us, my generation, but especially for her children in their generation. It suddenly meant that my mother was the matriarch, kind of like overnight. That is something that happened. That's not something she was ready for in any way, shape, or form, but here it was. The story that was told to my mother and her siblings and to us, to the grandchildren, is that one of my grandmother's sister-in-laws was over visiting. She would come a couple times a week to check on my grandmother and my great-grandmother, make sure they were eating, make sure everything was going okay. And she just helped my grandmother back from the bathroom, and my grandmother was, sitting up in her bed. And my great aunt heard my great grandmother yell from the other room because she was in the kitchen. She's like, "I'll see you later," or "I'll talk to you later." And my great aunt didn't think about it because she was in the middle of chopping or doing something. And then she thought, wait, she can't go anywhere. She can't get out of that bed without my help. And when she went back into the other room to check on my grandmother had passed. So that's like one of those family stories where you're just like, as a little kid, you're totally freaked out by it. But when you get older, you understand. A big topic in the family immediately after my grandmother's death was, how in the world are we gonna tell her mother, his name was F, and how is she going to take this, that her daughter is gone, that she's lived with for the past 15 years. It was just a lot. And so I don't remember which one of my aunts sort of drew the short straw and would go have to tell her grandmother that her daughter was gone. I just remember being a little kid standing in the doorway of my great grandmother's bedroom, just standing there listening to my aunt talk to her because I was curious as a child, or nosy, depending on how you want to look at it. And my great grandmother was like in her rocking chair, which is where she spent a lot of her time looking out the window. And I don't know what my aunt started to say or started to try to say, but my great grandmother looked at her and said, "You don't have to tell me. I know my daughter is gone. I can feel it." And again, as a little kid, you're just totally spooked by that. But now I understand what happened, what that meant. And again, this is a repeat from episode 6. Sorry, this gets me a little emotional, remembering all these sad incidences from my life, but also teaching moments that really did teach me a lot about honesty and about not sugarcoating things, even things as hard as death, from people, because people will find out and people will come to their own understanding in their own time. And it is really not our place to sort of be in the middle of people and their grief. Because again, grief is something we have to do on our own. There was no help that my mother or her siblings, her grandchildren, could provide to my grandmother that was going to make that situation any better. There was nothing any of them could do. She lost her child. But the good thing about it was because they were all willing to be so honest and to not try to hide this from her, it made everybody stronger through their own grief because they saw how my great grandmother handled this situation and handled her daughter's death. And so those are the three deaths from my young childhood that were very sharp and very profound, and why I remember them so vividly so many years later. What I always tell people who've never experienced the death of someone close to them is there is no such thing as being ready. That's a farce. It's a misnomer. It's just not factual. It really doesn't matter if someone you love is diagnosed with a terminal disease and they die after a long fight and a long illness, or if someone you love walks out tomorrow and gets hit by a bus. It does not matter. There is no preparing for that moment. It is going to be devastating regardless. And what I know now is people mean well, for the most part. They really do. After someone dies, in the African American tradition especially, there is something called a repast. And a repast is essentially people come to your house, to the house of the person who died, unless you have it at a church or something. But when I was a kid, it was always at the house of the person who died. And you bring the family food for several days so that they don't have to worry about cooking or anything like that. And you sit with them and you talk with them, and you may tell stories about the person who died. You may decide that's not something you want to talk about at all. But you bring food and you bring fellowship. And that's what a repast is about. It's about fellowship. Culturally, I think it's similar to the Irish do something called an Irish wake, where you all get together and have food or have some alcohol or both. And, you raise a glass to the person who died. So it's similar in that way. When you go to a repast, it depends very much on what the family is like of the person who died, whether they want you to be there for a couple minutes, 20 minutes, 2 hours, or all day. I've been to all versions of that, of a repast. And it really is something that brings comfort to the loved ones of the person who died, because grieving and grief is what the people who are left behind have to do. The person who is gone is gone. They are no longer in pain. They are no longer in that process. But you are in pain as a person left behind, and you were in that process. And so what used to really bother me, I guess most especially when my father died, was people said things that just sent me over the edge. They would say, he's no longer in pain. Okay, I got that. he's in a better place. Okay, your father was such a good person and he deserves to be somewhere out of pain. Okay. And I understood all that. But as a 17-year-old, I didn't really want to hear it. That's just the truth. And even today, as a 53-year-old, I still can't imagine being able to put on that much of a good face hearing those sorts of things. You know that, you understand that, but at that particular moment is really not when you want to hear it. So, what I say to people who've never been in the situation where they've lost someone is when you have to go to a wake, to a funeral, to a repast, to an Irish wake, to whatever you have to go to for someone else, just be there. I know it feels weird and awkward to not say anything about the situation, but sometimes it's just better do not say anything. As weird as that sounds. In the years since my father's death, there have been, of course, time marches on, there have been several more deaths in our family that I've had to, be a grown up and deal with and accept. And I am the type of person that will always say what's on my mind, whether it's particularly popular or not. Now, that's not to say, what I always say is you never have to be the loudest person in the room to get your point across. I'm not someone who has to run up in people's faces and say, this is how it is, blah, 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 blah. That's not who I am. But the person I am is the person who's going to say, listen, I've been there, I've done that, here's how it comes out. So probably 15 years ago now, which is hard to believe, my godfather died. Well, let me clarify that. My Catholic godfather died. I had a Protestant godfather and a Catholic godfather, which is a story for another day. It's a complicated story. But my Catholic godfather died, and he and I were really close, and that was very devastating. But his death was interesting in many ways because he was a funeral director. That's what he did for a living. And so, on the one hand, you've got all these people at this funeral, sad and grieving, and, they knew him well and they were his family and his friends. But you've also got this group of people who were sad and mourning because he was their friend and they knew him well. But this is what they did for a living. So they were kind of a little more, I don't want to say detached, but I guess that's the right word. And so it was just an odd grouping of people together. So after the service, people were getting up and talking about my godfather and who he was and what he meant to them and all that sort of thing. And this was a Baptist service. And I heard a lot about, here's a word that pushes my buttons. If it's a word you like, great, but this just, for me, this pushes my buttons. I heard a lot about homegoing. And honestly, homegoing is not a word I'd ever heard until Whitney Houston died. And they talked about having a homegoing service. And I was like, what is this? We're going to a funeral. But a lot of people, it makes them feel better to think that, or to feel that it's not a funeral, it's not a goodbye, it's a celebration that this person is going home to be with God. That is what homegoing means. You have passed on and your soul is going to be reunited with the Creator. I don't have a problem with that concept. It's just that word drives me crazy. Two more words that drive me crazy that have become popular with funerals are sunrise and sunset, which is a reference to sunrise is when the person was born, and sunset is when the person died. It just drives me totally nuts. I'm like, can we just say, I'm a writer. I like things very plain. So I'm like, can we just say funeral, born, died? Can we not make this complicated? But I understand it doesn't work for everybody. But at my godfather's funeral, there was a lot of talk about his homegoing and his going to be with God and all these sorts of things that just kept like ratcheting up my frustration with the whole situation. And so when it was my turn to get up and speak, my husband looked at me because he was like, "Oh no, you're about to go say something that's gonna set this church on fire." And I did. But I didn't think it was such a tremendously controversial thing to say, but apparently it was. So I got up and talked about, who my godfather was and the things we did together and how much I'd miss him and all that sort of thing. Sitting in the front row was my godmother, his wife, and his two grown children. My god sister was probably in her mid 40s, and my god brother was in his late 20s, I would guess. And what I said was to them, I have been where you are, and I'm going to tell you two things. Time heals all wounds is a myth, and closure is a lie. And as soon as those words left my mouth, I really did think that church was gonna just either burn to the ground or roast me at the stake. One of those two things. Everybody was just shocked and horrified that I would say such a thing. So when the service was over, there was a whole lot of like whispering and little groups of people. But my god sister and god brother came over to me and said, "Thank you for telling us the truth. Because, yeah, we know you've been where we are, and we are so thankful that you said what you said." So, what I know now that I didn't know as a kid when all those deaths happened in my life, and even what I didn't know as a 40-something-year-old woman when my godfather died, is that it's super important for you to always tell the truth, speak the truth, whatever your truth is, when that moment in time comes. It is always important for you to say what you feel and say what needs to be said, because that's the time and the opportunity you have to do that. So that's what I wanted to share today. I apologize for being a bit more emotional. I can pretty much guarantee I'm going to be more emotional in episode 8 when we do Grief the Sequel, because that is specifically going to be about my father's death and the circumstances before and after. But again, I think this is super important because this is not something we talk about nearly enough. So thank you for joining me for this episode. I look forward to seeing you again next week. Again, What I Know Now is available wherever you get your podcasts. And if it's something you'd rather watch, if you want to see me sort of ruin my makeup, you can watch it on YouTube on my channel, Brick City Brown Chick. I will see everyone next week. Thank you so much.